we have all these pictures that come out of Western art. These pictures done in Europe in the 1500s of little grassy knolls with 3 pretty crosses on them and things like that. And nothing like that ever happened. First off, there are no grassy knolls. The entire country is rugged rock. It's hard. Okay? You don't dig a hole anywhere in the whole country.
This is the Land and the Bible podcast. All right, welcome to episode 7 of the Land and the Bible podcast. This is episode 7 of the series Passion Week.
Mm-hmm.
And we just did Peter's denial, or St. Peter at Gallicantu.
Well done, yeah.
Thank you.
You're Latin expert.
Yeah. And now we're going to talk about Golgotha.
Let's say the place of the skull.
The place of the skull, which, I've always thought that Golgotha sounds like a great Christian metal band.
Yeah. Could be.
And
Could be.
The Place of the Skull would be the name of the album.
I like it.
Yeah, it's possible.
Do you have the cover art yet?
I'm working on stuff. It's a bus to honor the bus station, which is now.
Oh, I like that. Okay, I was like, connection? There's a connection?
But we'll get to that.
Okay.
So, what are we going to be covering in this episode?
Well, like as is our purpose, we want to talk about the history and the geography and what's going on there physically. And then we want to transition from that over into, what's going on at a devotional level. What's our takeaway from this? It's one of the 2 or 3 most important events in human history, right? It's the crucifixion. Of course, resurrection is more important. The incarnation, probably more important. But the crucifixion's right up there with the most important events, in the history of mankind. And so, what can we take away from it? Is there something that us little mere humans 2,000 years later what can we learn? What if Jesus is who we're supposed to be like? He's who we're supposed to live like. He's who we're supposed to emulate. What is there to emulate? In this horrific thing that happens.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll land it with that.
All right. Where are we beginning?
Well, let's just start with talking through the physical setting. If you go to Jerusalem now, there are 2 candidate sites for the crucifixion. One of them is at the Holy Sepulchre Church. It's the Catholic Greek Orthodox site, Armenian, sort of the ancient church site. For the burial and resurrection of Christ, which I will say did possibly take place there,
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even likely took place there. But contained within the same building, there's also like an outcropping of rock that they claim to be Golgotha, or the place of the crucifixion. I really just don't think that site has any authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're getting into opinion and things that happened thousands of years ago, and I understand all of that. But there are just some basic things about how Romans functioned and operated that site doesn't fit with. If you read your text, this is in it. Well, okay, so I will say from the outset, okay, that I am a Protestant evangelical. I don't come from a Catholic or Greek Orthodox or Armenian Orthodox sort of background. I don't come from those kind of churches.
Mm-hmm.
I come from these kind of churches here in the States, that I grew up in. So does that predispose me? Certainly. Having said that, as a student of the Bible and a historian of, at some level, amateur historian, I just don't think that site works as the place of his death.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into how crucifixions work and why I don't. I actually very much do like the place of crucifixion at the Garden Tomb. Let me first say, before I say anything else, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the right answer is we don't know. Of these 2 candidates, I prefer a certain one, and I'll sort of lay out the case a little bit, why I think it works. But even if it's not that exact site, it's somewhere like that. So I think we can zero in on what the crucifixion looked like, and then we can figure out where that may have been, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's sort of the best way to move through all of this. So if you go, and you really, really should, if you ever get a chance, you really should. If you go on the Holy Land tour and you go to Jerusalem and you go to the Garden Tomb, they will take you to a platform, an overlook platform, and you will look out across a modern day bus station.
That was my context. That's the cover art.
Yeah, that's right. It makes sense now. You look out across this to a cliff face, and they'll show you a picture from, a little over 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. And they'll say, see, you could kind of see a skull in that cliff. So we think this was the place of the skull.
Right.
And so we think this was it. The cliff looking somewhat skull-like. I mean, project that back 2,000 years. There's been earthquakes. I don't really know how much that figures into the fact that the cliff face looked somewhat skull-like. I don't know that's a part of what was going on. I think the fact that lots and lots of people got crucified and stoned and killed there for hundreds of years, that it was a place of execution, and gets it a name like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's ominous, sort of scary name. So I don't really put any creed into what that cliff looked like. But there are some other things about that space that are very, very interesting. Okay. So here's the first thing you have to know. The city of Jerusalem was built over many stages. Okay. You had a pre-biblical stage, going back to Melchizedek and that whole thing. You had sort of a Canaanite stage where the Jebusites were in charge. So the Israelites were in the country, but they couldn't take it. Then David takes it, and you have an early Israelite stage, where the city really blows up under Solomon, because has a peaceful kingdom and a really strong economy and does a whole lot of building. And then you have, a long time, over a couple hundred years of kingdom era, which these kings of Israel are sort of, passing through there, people like Hezekiah and those guys, and they're building up the city, of course, and it's destroyed by the Babylonians and it's rebuilt after that, like Nehemiah and Ezra and those stories. So you have these, successive constructions and destructions and destructions and constructions over time. What we know, or what at least the archaeologists believe they know, and they point us towards, is the fact that during the time of David and Solomon, when you had a lot of building in the city, it was called the city of David, which is actually south of where the old city is now. It's the original city was actually just outside of the walls of the current city. But when all that was being built, that they were actually quarrying above. So because you got to think about it, it's really, really mountainous territory, and you want to build a building. Well, if you could dig the rock out of higher up the hill, then you can just roll it down into place. And that's a whole lot easier than digging rock down here and lifting multi-ton stones up. Nobody wants to do that, right? So quarrying was done. And to do the construction on the city, and if you stand there at the Garden Tomb and you stand on that platform and you look at that cliff face, what you're seeing is not a natural cliff. You're seeing a rock face that is been left there as the result of quarrying probably 1,000 or 1,400 years before Christ was crucified. Okay. Mm-hmm. So going back previously. And what's really interesting is that if you stand there and you look at that cliff, you can pivot about, 90 degrees or so, 120 degrees. And you can look at there's another cliff face that's in the old city wall just opposite, that's also not natural, and it's the result of quarrying. So you've got a cliff face here and a cliff face here. They're not natural. And what that means is that here in the middle, there should be a hill. There should be a mountain there. There should be a dome there that's gone, but it was all cut out and removed to be building stone and sent down the hill farther at some point in the past. Okay? Mm-hmm. so that when you look at that cliff and you project the line to the other cliff and you realize that ridge should run there and it should continue on, what you find is that you're actually at the high point of a place that biblically is called Mount Moriah. Okay? You might know it as the Temple Mount. It's actually the north end of the Temple Mount. Okay? Okay, so who cares? Why does that matter? Hold that thought. What it produced, so let's hold that thought on why it matters, and let's just talk through what we know about Roman crucifixion. Now, what that quarrying had done is it created a flat space just north of the city, just outside of the gate, and it created a natural roadway. Because now you got flat, or it used to be really, really hilly and rough. Now it's really, really flat. And so there's a road that ran parallel along the front of the old city on the north side, going down to Jericho to the east, and then carrying on down to the sea to the west. Also, there's a road coming out of that north end of the old city going due north. To this day, it's called Damascus Gate, which means you exit from here to get onto the road that goes to Damascus, so to the north. So you have a road intersection point right there at the north side of the old city created by this quarrying. Why is that important? It's important because crucifixions are always done outside of the city. Never inside, always outside. Okay? For any execution, okay? Because Jews considered bodies to be unclean. You don't want unclean in the city. You got outside the city. We know that in Jewish stoning, often instead of throwing rocks at the person, now they could do that. They did often, just in a fit of whatever, like with Stephen, I think they threw rocks at him. But often what they did, because to stone is to kill with the stone. Well, another way you can kill with the stone is you take someone up on that cliff and you just push them off. It's easier, than throwing rocks. That's kind of violent. It takes a long time. Instead, you bind them hand and foot, and two of the witnesses who stood against them in court and accused them actually are commissioned to push the person over the ledge. And then you kind of look over, and if they're thoroughly dead, then you're done. And if they're kind of wounded and gasping or something, you drop a big rock on them and finish them off. And so that was done there. Clearly that was done there. Okay, it was a place of execution. Likely Stephen was executed very close to where Jesus was executed. Okay. And so then the Romans come in, and it would be normal for them to be like, yeah, okay, fine. We'll do this here too. Because the Romans had a pattern. The Romans, if they're going to take the time out of a day to crucify somebody, which it's a bit of work. It's easier to just kind of cut a throat and be done with it. If you're crucifying somebody, it's work, it's time. You got to leave guards there. If you're going to do that, you're making a point. You're not just killing somebody. You are doing everything in your power to kill someone in the most humiliating, painful, wretched, awful way you can possibly come up with. And so if you're going to do that, you do it in public. You make it visible. You want to scare people. You want to intimidate people. If you cross us with this to you, it's a tool of terror. Okay, it's state terror. Well, if you're doing that, then you do it on roadsides. The Romans always, I don't know of any historical record of Romans crucifying other than on roadsides. Well, there may be some exceptions, like during sieges, where they would crucify people sort of up on, they want the people inside the city to see it, so they would maybe lift them up on a hill, but that's for a specific purpose or a specific reason. It was always for display. Display is the point, right? And so it was virtually always roadsides. So I feel very confident in saying Jesus was not, we have all these pictures that come out of Western art, these pictures done in Europe in the 1500s of little grassy knolls with 3 pretty crosses on them and things like that. And nothing like that ever happened. First off, there are no grassy knolls. The entire country is rugged rock. It's hard. Okay. You don't dig a hole anywhere in the whole country. It's incredibly difficult to dig a hole anywhere. There's no topsoil, 90% of the country. It's just rock and hard. So the idea of a little grassy, pretty knoll is not really realistic. It would have been a roadside. I think this is clear also from the interactions that take place, because Jesus is talking back and forth with the people who are there. They're clearly close to him. He's dying from exhaustion. He can't breathe properly. So if he's talking, it's probably very low tones, except for occasionally when it says, and in a loud voice, he said. And then, okay, so that's a little something more. But generally speaking, I think they're close. It's intimate. Okay. So there's your first sort of adjustment to the sort of standard picture, roadside. And it's clear in the gospel, by the way. All 4 gospels say he was crucified at Golgotha, not on. Not a single one of them uses the word on. They all say at. So I think the foot of is much more accurate, which, pushes me over towards that site. It was a roadside. It pushes me towards that site. Okay. So other things that we don't normally think of when we envision it, the nails were not in the palm of the hand. In Semitic languages, so like Arabic and Hebrew, to this day, the word hand means from the elbow down. So we say hand and it means from the wrist down. When they say hand, it means from the elbow down. So anything from here to here is your hand. So it's completely linguistically accurate to say, that the nails were placed in his hands and for them to be in the wrist, which is where they have to be, because you can't bear the weight of a human body. This is grotesque, but it's just true. It happened. A nail in the palm would tear out.
Right.
A nail in the wrist, we would have the bone structure there to hold it, and it would not. Okay. So like we know that. Okay. I think that we can just say we know that. So, okay. So there's something that's, a little different than how we visualize it. So it's a roadside, it's low. I think most historians believe that the vertical piece of the cross was permanently in the ground because it was so difficult to dig there. They would have been permanently placed. And, when Jesus is walking to the place of crucifixion, he's carrying the cross beam. And again, this is all heavy and it's a little bit grotesque, but it is just what happened. That, you have this cross beam tied to your wrist. You're extended out here. It's a heavy piece of wood across your back. The crowd would be encouraged. First off, the streets are very narrow and rocky anyway. And the crowd would be encouraged to trip you, push you, things like that. So you have to imagine falling, but your hands are tied back here. So you can't put your hands out in front. You've got a heavy thing behind your head. You're going to hit your face on the ground. It's just awful for a long time. And I don't think we sort of normally have Jesus carrying a cross like this over his shoulder, which I don't think is exactly maybe what happened. Then he gets there to be crucified, and we normally have this picture of them sort of laying down. They do it, and they sort of stand this thing up. I think what the historians believe now, at least sort of what was advocated to us, when we were studying all this, was that you probably just stood there and you just sort of picked your feet up, so your feet were just really a few inches off the ground. So you were eye level. You weren't high. Eye level by the road, intimate, close. You're beaten, half to death before it even starts. I don't know that we'll go deeply into all that, but the Roman scourging was just brutal. You had your skin just flayed, ripped off in ribbons. You're already bleeding out. You're carrying this thing. You get there. You're supposed to stand in place. They nail you, and now you're dying on a cross. You're beat to death. You're naked, in public. And then these guys, like, you read this story, it's just so brutal. All that's going on, and they're just making fun of him. Oh, come down from there. Oh, you said you were this. And I always think, like, for these ladies, like the Marys and people that did go with him all the way, what was that like? What was it, what's it like if you're Mary, the mother of Jesus, to stand there while they ridicule your boy, while they kill him? Like, I don't want to kill somebody myself, that had to be utterly horrific. It's just a tough scene. It is a tough scene. And if you accept, certainly I do, that the Bible is the word of God. And if you accept Jesus' words as accurate, then he says in the midst of all that, I could call down angels and stop all of this. And so the reality is that what's going on, it's so brutal, it's so cruel, it's so horrific. It's as if like, Satan and all the demonic forces are just unleashing every cruelty they can imagine, just firing them away at him. And he just takes it all. He could stop it, but he just takes it. And so that's just a crazy, dark sort of thing to think about. But let's get back to why I think that hill matters a little bit. Mm-hmm. Because there's some strange things, like we talked about in the Temple Mount series, the Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount, and how when the temple was dedicated, that God says that my attention will never leave this place. Now, I don't really understand why God would have a piece of real estate that, he has just sort of like, I really like that hill, like why do you like that hill any more than a hill in like Wisconsin or something? I don't know, or Russia. But it does seem through Scripture that God really, really likes Mount Moriah, and he would really, really like to be worshiped from there. I mean, you have the temple there and on and on and on. It just seems like there's sort of a theme running through of that. Jesus in the week leading up to this is in the temple, which is on that mountain, arguing and, debating and fighting with these, Pharisee guys and trying to straighten out their worship and their religion. It's like there's just a thing goes on there. Well, the first time that's mentioned, that place is mentioned, is in Genesis chapter 22. And you have this very, very strange story. It's one of these stories where it's like, I don't even know how to explain this in a way, or why would God do this? Which is because it's the story of the binding or sacrifice of Isaac. Mm. Okay. And, and you don't have time, and it's not the right context. The context is is what happened to Jesus and the crucifixion, and trying to separate us from some of our Western visuals on it and get accurate visuals, but then also to land on what does it mean to us. And when Isaac is offered, so the whole story is crazy. Isaac is the son of promise. Abraham was old, and God said, we're going to give you a son. And, they were kind of like, that's not possible. We're too old. And there's this miracle, and they have the son. And so for Abraham and Sarah, Isaac is just like, this is our boy. This is it. Now we're going to have ancestors, and we have a future. And when we die, it's not all over. And this is so awesome. And they're so, so, so excited to have this baby, to have this boy. And then one day, the Bible says this in chapter 22, it says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, here I am. Abraham answered, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. Go to the land of Moriah. Okay, so Mount Moriah, Temple Mount, go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Okay, so get close, and I'll show you the right hill. I cannot prove that the hill, okay, I can't sit here and say, it was the same hill, because we don't know. Actually, let's be honest with the text. We don't actually know. It says get close, and I'll show you exactly which hill. Okay, so is just true. But they go, and there's I won't read through the story, but there's a ton of foreshadowing throughout the story. Okay, first off, just so you'll know, Isaac is grown. He's not 6 or 8. Sometimes artistically, like he's a kid. We know he's older because later in the story, when Abraham gets to the mountain, he says, hey, Isaac, carry up the wood for the sacrifice. Well, the wood for the sacrifice is going to be enough wood to burn up and consume his body. That's a lot of wood. Mm-hmm. A 6 or 8-year-old can't carry 50, 70 pounds of wood. You just can't do it, right? So Isaac is clearly, adult side. The word in Hebrew is yeladim or yeled, I think, which basically means young man. Mm-hmm. Depending on what scholar you talk to, some will say as old as like he was in his early 30s, but I think maybe it's more likely he was like 19-ish.
18,
yeah, he was like 18, 19, I think is probably maybe more likely. But but Isaac, there's a ton of foreshadowing here. So let's assume it's the same mountain, just for the sake of argument. He's going up the same mountain. He's carrying the wood. That's the implement of the sacrifice, same as Jesus carried. He's willing, the same as Jesus was willing. Like Isaac eventually lays down on that altar to be killed. And he's old enough and strong enough that he could have fought his 100-year-old dad. He's a willing sacrifice. He's, Isaac is a human, so I can't say he's sinless, but he's innocent, let's say. Like there's so many parallels going on, right? In the story. And then at the end of it, you get this crazy thing. It says, just as he reached out, so you got to kind of imagine Abraham, like, he's about to kill his son. He's like, I got the knife up here, and it says, just as he did this, and the angel of the Lord, which is maybe like sort of like a pre-incarnate Jesus, where I think the angel of the Lord is a weird thing. It's like the embodiment of God, basically. Says, Abraham, here I am. Don't lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. Like, whoa, stop. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its thorns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named the place the Lord will provide, or Jehovah Jireh. Okay, it's like, we would say it, like in song and stuff, Jehovah Jireh, my provider, that kind of thing. So he names the place God will provide. So today it is said it will be provided on the Lord's mountain. Okay, now so I think that's important because the Lord's mountain is definitely the Temple Mount, right? Which is Mount Moriah. And it said that it will be provided here. There will be provision on this mountain. So I think, I cannot prove, but I believe, that what took place was that God stops this binding of Isaac is more than just a one-off. That it's a foreshadowing, it's a foretelling, it's archetypal. And that God stops it and says, no, I'm going to provide the sacrifice. And he means more than just that ram in the thicket. He means the sacrifice. And then he says the Lord will provide on this mountain, which ends up being Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. And then if you go back to what I was saying about the quarrying, what you find is that while that chunk has been cut out, it is Mount Moriah. It's the north end. Does that kind of prove anything? I don't know.
It's a compelling story, though.
But it's what I think. Yeah. It feels like it should be true to me. That's really, really bad. But but even if it's not the exact right spot, then the story is the same. That God says, I'm going to provide the sacrifice. And then 3,800 years later, he provides the sacrifice in the form of himself, in the form of his son. Not Abraham's son, but his own son. Okay. So what's the takeaway from that? What's the takeaway from God offering his own son? What's the takeaway from him pausing Abraham, saying, no, I'm going to do this? And then it happens. To me, in this promise that God will provide, God will provide on this mountain. He will do it. And then he does it 3,800 years later. My takeaway on that is that God keeps his promises. Sometimes they take a little bit longer than we wanted. They don't necessarily always come in like we want something to happen just like this, like, oh, you promised you'd heal, whatever. Okay, I'm better now. Great. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. We want everything to be quick and fast and easy. Sometimes God takes his time. But in the end, he's always, always, always 100% without exception faithful. Like that's just what it is, So for me, there's a big takeaway there. But let's roll forward. Okay, so instead of having one big takeaway, let's have two sub takeaways today. But let's roll forward what happens actually at the cross, because on the cross we have some interesting things that happen, and so I've made my case for why I think it's where I think it is geographically, and a little bit of takeaway from there. But I want to just think through Jesus on the cross. He's being killed in the most brutal way possible. And in the midst of being killed in the most brutal way possible, there are some things that are going on. First off, as he's being killed, like you just kind of a little bit of a quick study of the words of Christ from the cross. From the cross as he's dying, Luke 23:34, he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. These very people that are having him killed, the Roman soldiers, the Jewish aristocracy, all these people that are, let's kill this guy. Instead of wanting his vengeance on them, he says, God, don't hold this against them. They don't know. I have a hard time forgiving people that talk bad about me.
Right.
Like people say bad things about me, which half of them are probably true. and 6 months later, I'm still angry about it. I can't believe they said that. That wasn't fair. I mean, Jesus is sitting there getting nails driven through his hands by people that don't care, because of people who lied, like all this swirl of the most injustice possibly imaginable. And instead of saying, God, zap these people, which I do, I can't lie. I do that. I'm a human. There are times when I'm like, well, God, if there's justice, you got to fix this. He's praying that God will forgive. He's ministering to the thief on the cross. This guy is dying. I don't know that I really support the death penalty for thievery, but at least he's a criminal. At least he did something to be there. Mm-hmm. He's dying, and in dying, he expresses some level of faith in Jesus. And Jesus, was like, hey, man, take comfort. You'll be with me in paradise today. Like, I'm going to take you to heaven with me. Just hang on, buddy. He's comforting the other guy. And again, I think about myself. And I'm like, well, what do I typically do? What do I typically do when I'm, suffering? It's a I don't know, whatever. It's a trope. It's a cliche. But what do? You have a bad day at work, you take it home and you yell at your kids. Mm-hmm. And I think all of us do that to a certain extent. Like we get into our own suffering, we get into our own pain, we get into our own whatever is going on, and then we just totally forget. Well, maybe somebody's actually worse off than you are. Because at least Jesus knew he was in God's will. He knew that, I'm suffering, but I'm suffering with a purpose to accomplish something. Mm-hmm. This guy's just dying because he was stupid and got caught as a career criminal. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus reaches out and says, like, I'm going to take care of you and minister to you right now. We don't typically minister out of our pain. Not very often, and Jesus does that. And then one of the big ones is, and this is in John 19, 26 through 27. He looks down at Mary and John, and he says, when Jesus saw his mother and disciple he loved. Now, John is kind of funny like that. John always calls himself the disciple Jesus loved. Like, I was his favorite kid. I was his favorite one. Whatever. There's a little something going on there. But he says he looked at them and he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." So as he's dying, he's caring. Mm-hmm. He realizes, like his mom is going to need somebody to take care of him. John, take care of her. He realized that John really loved him and is going to be lonely and alone. And he says, "Mom, treat him like a son." So he's ministering from the cross. And I read those things. And again, for us as humans, we typically take our suffering as an excuse to stop caring for others. Well, why can't you give? Because I've had a bad month financially. Well, why can't you do this? Well, I've been really busy. Like we typically take our own suffering, our own pain as a reason to take a time out or a break from caring for others. Jesus, in the midst of horrific things we can barely imagine, just continues throughout, those 3 hours he's on the cross to minister, minister, and love others while he suffers. And I look at that and think, ugh. So
Well, I will say, it reminds me of going to funerals of Christians that where the family members that are experiencing loss take it as an opportunity to minister to the people there that maybe don't believe. Which unfortunately, I've been to too many of those. But it kind of rings to that, because in that moment, it's like you're being ministered to through truth, and the story is not done. So you have a little bit of extra, that you can, for the people that obviously are processing it differently. So, but it's always impressive, because we're sitting there as bystanders and we're thinking, how can this person be going through this and have this type of ability to do that right now? Because we're just sitting there feeling for them, thinking that this is so difficult, but then they're ministering to everyone that's in attendance.
I guess what it gets down to,
that,
Sure. And I think what it gets down to in a way is, if your faith is authentic,
right,
it actually, the way is if it does work on the toughest day.
Right. It's that test that you were talking about in a previous episode.
Yeah, I think so. If your faith is legitimate, it works on the roughest day. And to your point, I've heard stories, my whole life about, people who at the funeral of their own children, gather and sing, God is so good. He's so good to me. And thinking of these choruses like this. And as a result of that, then other people come to faith.
Right.
Because they're unbelievers and they see that and they're like, if you can act like that on that day, woof. I watched a television episode. It was a news broadcast. I lived in the Middle East for a long time, so I got to see some Middle Eastern news, which is often a little bit brutal. And a few years back, ISIS, in the Middle East, they call them Daesh, which is actually the same thing as ISIS. It's abbreviations, but it's in Arabic instead of English. But anyway, they hauled several, I forget exactly how many it was. It looked like 8 or 10 maybe, Egyptian Coptic Christian believers, men, out onto a beach in Libya, and they killed them all. They cut their heads off. Grotesque. And all of these men were given the opportunity. All they had to do was say, like, sort of the Islamic Shahada, just, basically deny Christ and we won't kill you. And none of them did. And they were all killed. And I watched a news broadcast out of Egypt shortly thereafter. And the newscasters were interviewing the mother of one of these men. And they said, what would you do? And these were sort of secular Muslims, so they were sympathetic to the mother. They weren't, they weren't okay with what had been done. They were upset with what had been done. And they said, what would you do if you saw those men? The ones that killed your son? And the woman said, if one of those men walked down my street right now, I would invite him in for tea and for food, and I would tell him, thank you so much. And they're like, whoa, stop. Thank you? Yes. I would tell them thank you because they left the audio on the recording. And I could hear my son say the name of Jesus with his last breath. So I know he's in heaven and I'm okay. And I was just like, whoa. And the newscasters weren't even Christian, they were Muslims. They were just like, this is not real. You're not, Wow. And when they cut back to the desk, they were just like,
yeah,
they shouldn't even know how to respond, and the woman made some kind of statement about these people are made of iron or something, like they're so tough in their spirit, but they were just like, couldn't even handle it,
Yeah.
But I guess that's the way it is. Like if your faith is genuine, it has to hold up on the worst day, and for Jesus, it did. Like, he's so authentic to the end, and that's such a challenge to us. And I think that's why he says, at the Last Supper, he says, he says, man, you're going to go through a lot. He doesn't pull any punches with the disciples. He's like, they're going to torture you. They're going to kill you. They're going to treat you awful because of me. And he says, but be of courage because I've overcome the world. And the point he's making is like, I'm going to go through all these things before you go through them. And I'm going to do it the right way, and the same spirit that's in me can be in you. And I'm not promising you to get out of the suffering. I'm promising you that you can have a spirit in you that can go through it the right way and be victorious in it, which is like, that's what we're promised actually. So yeah, I guess that's what you see. And that's what we're supposed to emulate. Yeah.
That was great. That's tough content to go through, but there's a lot of great truth and things to acknowledge there in that. And I think it's gonna kind of tie nicely into what we're about to talk about next time, which is the tomb. So a lot more positivity in that one, a lot more hope.
Yeah. So and this is the one where Satan unleashes everything he's got.
Right.
And then the next one is, and the good guys win in the end. So that, the next one feels a lot better than this one. Yeah, gotcha. I think so. Yeah, that's probably going to be true. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, click like and subscribe. It really helps us. And if you really enjoyed it, go on over to our website, thelandofthebible.com, and become a supporter. It helps us generate more content and gives you access to our full library of video and Bible study content.